What's about to happen with this video is something that's never happened on the channel before. It won't ever happen again. It's very rare that for this channel that I make a mistake.
What?
This be one of the few exceptions. I've been told numerous times, hey, you need to take a look at the British Crusade against slavery. We're going to take another look at it. Because I've already done it once, and it stayed up for all of about 2 hours.
But why?
And because of some of the comments that were in there and me doing a very shit job of research on the person who actually put the video up, I took it down because I'm an idiot at times. That being the prime example of that. It's been almost 3 years since that happened. We're going to revisit it. And I'm going to give some thoughts on what we hear because it's been, like I said, 3 years. So, yes, this isn't so much a reaction as much as it is a revisiting. So, let's get to it.
Britain's criminally stupid attitudes to race and immigration are beyond parody, by Frankie Bole. For those who aren't aware, Frankie Bole is a famous Scottish comedian who is most renowned for being pretty damn offensive. Needless to say, I'm a fan of his. And so when Frankie Bole writes an article for The Guardian of all places, with the subtitle, "The anti-immigration election rhetoric is perverse. We fear the arrival of people we have drawn here with the wealth we stole from them," I can see the misinformation coming a mile away. So Frankie begins the article by waffling in an overly verbose manner, reminiscent of Charlie Brooker, another man who I am a fan of, but has been led astray by misinformation. And it's full of these sort of contradictions that I'm sure sounded good when he was writing them, but when you actually think about it, are rather silly. I mean, here he is pointing out the irony of the leaders being nationalist and warning about the Scottish National Party, after making a crack about how the Scottish discovered penicillin, and taking credit for this for some reason. And for some reason, he seems to mix up the concepts of trade and immigration. But these really aren't very important. I'm not even bothered that he just assumes that an Australian-style point system for immigration will obviously be a racist system that caters exclusively to white people. You know, this is despite the fact that a Cambridge economics professor has warned the sheer scale of immigration has caused problems for the UK's infrastructure, which was largely...
See, this sounds like stuff that it's funny. You say anything not anti-immigration in and of itself, but however you start talking about close down the borders here in the U.S., and mostly speaking of the borders down there, our border with Mexico, you immediately started getting labeled a racist, and it's people I don't think they don't know the immigration statistics. We allow over 1 million immigrants legally into this country a year. People don't realize the fact that there's nothing wrong with immigration, but you've got to have a limit of the amount of people that take and come in. Right? There's only it's just you can't just be open to anybody and everybody. There has to be rules and everything. As an American, I can't just go across the border into Mexico without any kind of green card or, passport or visa of some sort, but yet we're expected to allow people from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Chile and other countries to come in that way. And it's crazy to me that wanting to protect your own borders, wanting to prevent people from coming in that you don't have a background for, kind of crazy. And it's also jumping the line of the people who actually do save up the money to get things done the right way to come here legally. Because not everybody that tries to come across the border are seeking asylum. So it's amazing to me because I think the term racist, using the term racist immediately shuts down any notion that you have there's any kind of argument that can be made against it. Because then that immediately attacks your credibility. Once you're branded a racist, unless it doesn't matter if you're proven not to be racist or not, your words almost immediately start falling on deaf ears. So this discredit tactic from people using terms like racist or fascist and other buzzwords and stuff like that. It's absolutely hilarious. So you got to have immigration policies, but it's funny that just the whole racist immigration policy, and it's like, bruh, bruh. Let's hear more of this, shall we?
Has warned the sheer scale of immigration has caused problems for the UK's infrastructure, which was largely built in the 70s. But you know what? None of that really bothers me. What really bothers me is Frankie Boyle's attempt to make British people feel ashamed of Britain's involvement in the slave trade. That really gets my goat, because Britain's involvement in the slave trade is one of the most proud accomplishments of British history. And I know what you're thinking, oh my goodness, slavery is bad. And that's correct. Which is why the British ended it.
Okay, so this is one of the things I kind of took umbrage with in the first go around of looking at this. Yes, they did end it. But that's after being the fourth largest exporters of slavery in the world. You might not have had slavery in England, but here in the U.S., while we were still colonies, it was allowed. There's other colonies where it was used, and the slaves were very much exported by British ships. So you might not have had slavery there on the mainland, but it's very much it's fine. Use it to export. Now, granted, a lot of that's East India, the trading companies and stuff like that over there, uh, British East India Company and stuff. So I mean, a lot of it, you get the mercantile aspect of it, but uh, that was when I was like, you ended it, but at the same point in time, you were one of the largest exporters of. So for me, that was one of the that's one of the things that kind of stuck in my craw because I was like, wait, what? What? That being said, you cannot take away the importance of Britain actually being like, no, this is wrong. We're not doing it. It's not something that we allow here. Shutting it down. And not only did it's that's one of the things that can't take away. As much as you might have messed up, you tried rectifying the situation and did so.
Everyone, if we just take a cursory look at the subject, you can see how it is not nearly as cut and dried as Frankie makes it out to be. Even the very word slave comes from Slav, because of the sheer number of Slavs taken as slaves by conquering peoples. But Frankie is trying to drum up white guilt, so let's talk about African slavery. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to start exploring the West African coast, and they did indeed capture African natives to be brought back to Portugal as items of curiosity. Europeans who travelled to Western Africa discovered that Western Africa had civilizations of its own. For example, a Dutch visitor to Benin City wrote in around 1600, "As you enter it, the town appears very great. You go into a great broad street, not paved, which seems to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Warmost Street in Amsterdam. The houses in this town stand in good order, one close and even with the other, as the houses in Holland stand. More than a century."
And see that right there, that's one of the things for people that want to take and do the straw man stuff as far as slavery. Oh yeah, they sold their own people into slavery. And make it sound like they all lived in mud huts and stuff like that when that's not. There was a few African kingdoms and civilization, like definitely like there were some civilizations there in Africa that definitely were advanced for what you might take and actually think of whenever you think of Africa, because you're led to believe that everybody was basically in a tribe of some sort, and it was all mud huts and outback and stuff like that, or jungle and things of that nature. When it's not the case whatsoever for every country or civilization that was in Africa. However, chattel slavery was definitely a part of the culture there, whether it be from conquering tribes, or you had the Ottoman Empire and the things of that nature that happened, as well as the British, or not the British, but the Romans. It's not like it was a new type thing that had just been introduced.
Century earlier, Benin exchanged ambassadors with Portugal. The Portuguese did take a few Africans back to Europe, but they didn't need to set up operations because they discovered that there were already thriving slave trades in Africa. And so they bought slaves from
Moors,
African
the
rulers and
Ottomans.
traders. The vast majority
Yeah.
of slaves taken out of Africa were sold by African rulers, traders, and military aristocracy who grew wealthy from the business. Most slaves were acquired through wars or by kidnapping. And before you start thinking that this is excessively barbaric, this was the standard for almost every civilized society all across the world.
A lot of folks forget that slavery wasn't a novel thing. The abolishment of slavery is a more novel concept within the last 200 years than in the whole of human history. That is one thing that is not taken into account whenever slavery is talking about it. It's one of the things that pisses me off so bad about people talking about the history here of the US. And it's like, bro, you do realize like this, that's been the narrative and the general consensus of how things worked throughout human history. You have warring tribes or warring nations, and upon winning, they would often subjugate the people of whoever they were invading, and they would turn a lot of the working men into slaves. A lot of the working women would wind up being concubines and stuff like that for kings and for the princes and different nobles and stuff. And they completely, not only would they break them militarily, but then they wound up breaking them psychologically. And of course, they reaped all the financial benefits. It's one of those things. It's the abolishment of slavery itself is more of a novel concept than slavery. Slavery is reprehensible, but throughout human history, it's been a constant, and people just don't seem to grasp that concept.
For example, in ancient Greece, Strabo tells us that the island of Delos trafficked in 10,000 slaves a day. Even before the Roman Empire, even when we're coming to the end of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC, it's estimated that a third of Italy was made up of slaves. Slaves made up of people whom the Romans had conquered and taken back to Italy to do hard labour. And so to anyone even slightly educated on this subject, it is absolutely unsurprising to find that, for example, in 1510, the capital of the Empire of Songhai was teeming with slaves. Slave trading in West Africa was common, but it was different to what you expect. It wasn't for commercial purposes. It was to show status and to give the wealthy African elite a comfortable life. And with the appearance of Europeans desperate to buy slaves for use in the Americas, the character of African slave ownership changed. Indeed it did. The character of slavery on the west coast of Africa changed to look a lot more like the character of slavery on the east coast of Africa, because we're going to talk about the Arab slave trade, specifically the circumstance of Swahili-speaking peoples. Unsurprisingly, the Arabs, being far closer to sub-Saharan Africa than the Europeans, had been taking advantage of it for far longer. They were a people with as much commercial nous as anyone else. The ruling class of coastal Swahili society, sultans, government officials, and wealthy merchants, used non-Muslim slaves as domestic servants and to work on farms and estates. And they even had plantations, such as the Omani Sultan Said, who became immensely rich when he started up clove plantations in the 1820s with slave labour. Arab Muslims settled along the coast and intermixed with the locals, forming a people and culture known as Swahili, which started in around the 10th century AD. So unsurprisingly, the East Africa slave trade was well established long before Europeans arrived on the scene and was driven by demands for labour by the sultanates of the Middle East. You might be thinking, well, that's interesting. If the Arabs had been in Africa for about 1,000 years, taking sub-Saharan African slaves, why isn't there a very large population of black people in Arabia? And the answer to that is that the Arabs used to castrate them, cock and balls entirely, a practice that was supposed to have ended in 1962 when slavery was finally outlawed in places like Saudi Arabia. This, of course...
And see, that's one of the things you even take and read about historical accounts is the eunuchs and things like that, that they basically turned them into eunuchs. They completely, and it was a form of control over the slave population that they took and that they had. It's very, yeah, does not sound like anything that yeah. Ooh, Jesus
Does
Christ.
not mean that the trade has actually stopped. It is still going on today. It's impossible to know exactly how many slaves the Arabs took from sub-Saharan Africa on the east coast, but one historian produced a total of 17 million slaves. I doubt it was that high, but again, we can't know, and it was for over 1,000 years that this was happening. The point is that slavery was
See, that's another thing that kind of stuck in my craw. I doubt it was that high, but it did happen over 1,000 years, which means the number could be actually higher. Like, there's some conjecture that's thrown in with some of the stuff here, and granted, some of it's from historical research and stuff. But then again, you've got 1,000 years of slavery just that has shows up on the radar with European expansion. That's not including, like, that's one of those. It's a hard number to swallow, regardless.
ubiquitous. No matter where on earth you travelled, you found slaves. In Europe, in China, in the Middle East, in the New World, in India, in Scandinavia, in Africa. Slavery was as common an institution as animal husbandry. The only thing that separated the Christian nations of Western Europe from anyone else on earth was the efficiency with which they could transport taken slaves. And it should come as no surprise that this was made possible by advances in technology that the rest of the world simply didn't have. The most common number I could find.
Okay, so wait a minute. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, fifth. So I was one off, but still, that's what I'm saying. It's like, Jesus.
Regarding the total number of slaves taken from Africa by Europeans was 11 million, and that is in about a 400-year time span. Portugal took the most slaves, with over 4.5 million transported to the New World. Then Britain with over 2.5 million, then Spain and France totaling just under 3 million. And just so no one is under any illusions, the transatlantic slave trade must have been close to hell on earth. Slaves were taken from Africa and packed into conditions so disgraceful and disgusting, it is unsurprising that there was such a high mortality rate for the crossing. As offensive as this is to look at, we have to remember that this is a consequence of dehumanization. The slaves were not people, they were chattel. It will obviously come as absolutely no surprise that the driving motivation behind slavery was economic. Portuguese merchants traded with Africans from trading posts they set up along the coast. They exchanged items like brass and copper bracelets for such products as pepper, cloth, beads and slaves, all part of an existing internal African trade. But the transatlantic slave trade really took off when Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. The Portuguese initially had a monopoly on the slave trade, but this was broken in the 16th century when England, followed by France and other European nations, entered the trade. Unsurprisingly, this was a massively profitable trade for everyone involved except the slaves. Africa's rulers, traders, and military aristocracy protected their interest in the slave trade. They discouraged Europeans from leaving the coastal areas to venture to the interior of the continent. European trading companies realized the benefit of dealing with African suppliers and not unnecessarily antagonizing them. The companies could not have mustered the resources it would have taken to directly capture the tens of millions of people shipped out of Africa. It was far more sensible and safer to give Africans guns to fight in the many wars that yielded capture.
More sensible and safer to give Africans guns to fight the many wars. Things really don't change a whole lot, do they? Because the gun trade and the arms trade is, yeah, it's still a thing. It's, well, some things just never change.
Trade. The slave trading network stretched deep into Africa's interior. Slave trading firms were aware of their dependency on African suppliers, and these African suppliers were making insane amounts of money. For example, the King of Benin was making £250,000 a year selling people into slavery in 1750, and his successor said in the 1840s that he would do anything the British wanted him to do, apart from giving up the slave trade. Quote, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery. With an industry so profitable to so many people involved, and so widespread as to be common to almost every nation on earth."
I'm gonna say this. I've seen this video. Like I said, I reacted to it once before, like 3 years ago. Bro, this is absolutely you forget after you haven't seen something for a while, and you go back to it to take and to refresh your memory and review it. Uh, how horrific some of the stuff that's in here is. I mean, granted, could you imagine being part of a empire or civilization there, and your people at one time had been subjugated by another empire, and a lot of your people had been sold to slavery, but you're able to take and get your freedom and then subjugate them and maybe others. 250,000 pounds. That was absolute insane money at that point in time. That had to have actually just ramped up the cycle of war amongst nations and tribes and everything else that was there in Africa at the time. Just, oh my God, that's horrific to think about. That is absolutely horrific to think about.
Why would the British want King Gezo to give up the slave trade? Well, we need to turn back the clock to 1066 and the Battle of Hastings, when a French-speaking Duke of Viking descent called William the Bastard defeated King Harold Godwinson of England. William the Bastard was refashioned as William the Conqueror and took the crown of England, and one of the first things he did as King of England was to have the entire country inventoried. This record was known as the Domesday Book, and we still have it. Thanks to this hard work, we know that around 1086, 10% of the recorded population of England was slaves. 20 years earlier, when he had first conquered England, William had enacted a series of laws, one of which prohibited the slave trade out of England. "I prohibit the sale of a man by another outside of the country on pain of a fine paid in full to me." We don't know what William's motivation for making this law was, but given that the punishment for breaking it was a fine, I doubt it was for humanitarian reasons. Whatever his reasons, within a generation of 1086, slavery had almost died out in England, presumably because William the Conqueror had outlawed the trade of slaves.
But you got to think some of that probably had to come from the fact that you had the Vikings that, had come over and taken the land there 2 or 3 times. And one of the things that the Vikings would do is they would take slaves. They would sell people into slavery, or they would use slaves themselves. And so I'm sure that's probably one of the reasons why that probably was enacted by William the Conqueror. Which, real quick, I did do Google real quick, and I thought, because slaves or thralls, very important commodity amongst. So I'm sure that's probably one of the reasons why, maybe because you still had at that point probably not near as many as before it had happened, but you did have Viking settlers that had stayed behind, even though that the Vikings had lost the kingdom there. Basically, they had lost the control over the people. So it's I'm sure that's probably one of the reasons, if I had to venture a guess.
Appears to also have been a trend for lords to endow their slaves to perform their ploughing functions as free ploughmen. While not a wonderful state of affairs, serfdom is better than chattel slavery, and this state of affairs was solidified by the Church at the Synod of Westminster in 1102, where the Church denounced simony, clerical marriages, and slavery. This made England a very unique case. There probably wasn't another country in the world at this time that had outlawed slavery. There were practically no motivations to do so. It was incredibly lucrative, endemic to the point of normalcy, so it wasn't even viewed as immoral, and the chances are William the Conqueror himself made the slave trade in England illegal just so he could make a quick buck. Fast forward 700 years, and the international transatlantic slave trade is in full swing, and yet we still do not have slaves in England. And this is where we meet a man named Granville Sharp, a very well-educated, rationalist thinker of the Enlightenment, who became an active campaigner for the abolition of the slave trade. Granville had had previous legal success defending Jonathan Strong from his erstwhile slave master, after being brought to England from the colonies, but we're going to look at the subsequent Somerset case. James Somerset was a slave from Virginia in America, who had come to England with his master Charles Stuart in 1769, and had run away in October 1771. After evading slave hunters employed by Stuart for 56 days, Somerset had been caught, put onto the slave ship Anne and Mary, to be taken to Jamaica and sold. 3 Londoners had applied to Lord Mansfield for a writ of habeas corpus, which had been granted, with Somerset having to appear at a hearing on the 24th of January in 1772. Members of the public responded to the plight by sending money to pay for his lawyers, who in any event gave their services pro bono publico, while Stuart's costs were met by the West Indian planters and merchants.
Boy, you want to talk about a clear example of classism as people of the public taking and not only giving money but offering free services, while the slave owners' costs were covered by, the aristocracy. So that's pretty cool.
Prior legal experience with the Jonathan Strong case, Sharp briefed Somerset's lawyers. The judgment was delivered on the 22nd of June 1772, and it was a clear victory for Somerset, Sharp, and the lawyers who had acted for Somerset. Mansfield acknowledged that English law did not allow slavery, and only a new Act of Parliament could bring it into legality. The verdict established one thing very clearly: a slave becomes free the moment he sets foot on English soil. And this was, according to Lord Mansfield, that the air of England is too pure for any slave to breathe. No matter what reason William the Conqueror outlawed slavery for, by the time this judgment was drawn by Lord Mansfield, it had become a point of principle. This precedent wasn't set for Mansfield's personal interests. This precedent was set to determine right from wrong. Granville Sharp went on to co-found the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade with fellow like-minded Enlightenment thinkers. And after 20 long years of campaigning in Parliament, which I won't detail here, they were successful in their goal of abolishing the international slave trade in 1807. Now, if you know anything about 1807, you'll know that this was during the War of the Fourth Coalition, where Napoleon Bonaparte was savaging great powers all across the European continent. The Napoleonic Wars led to new territorial acquisitions for Britain.
Just real quick, and that case with the slave basically being freed while his master had taken him there to England. Any slave on English ground, and the British Empire being as large as it was at that time, that was a lot of land where if you owned a slave and took them to English, to part of the British Empire, that would mean as soon as that slave left your boat and touched land, they're automatically free. That's it's pretty interesting because that's a wide range of places. That's basically that's most of the world at that.
And helped stuff Parliament with more abolitionists than they had before, which is why the bill providing for the abolition of the slave trade to conquered territories triumphantly passed in both houses. And the following year this was superseded by a stronger measure that outlawed the British Atlantic slave trade altogether. But, given the raging war in Europe, it was rather difficult to enforce due to a paucity of available resources. After 1807, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, having achieved its goals, became the African Institution, whose principal aim was to ensure the new legislation was enforced and that other countries followed Britain's example. Persuading other countries to join Britain outlawing the slave trade proved more difficult. Despite the efforts of the African Institution and those of British ministers, the Congresses of Paris and Vienna in 1814 and 1815 both failed to reach a specific agreement. Given that this was at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, it's hardly surprising that there was French opposition. Where diplomacy had failed, the Royal Navy had to succeed. It's one thing declaring a writ that people may no longer profit from the trading of human beings, it's another thing to enforce that. Enter the West African Squadron. The West Africa Squadron was a detachment of the Royal Navy that was given the task of blockading Africa, the continent, to make sure that slave traders were not taking slaves to the Americas. Needless to say, in 1807, there was only a token force performing this operation, comprising of 2 ships. This number was increased to 5 ships until the War of 1812 with the United States, but after 1815, with Britain victorious in Europe and supreme at sea, the Royal Navy turned its attention back to the challenge. The institution of slavery was formally abolished in the British Empire in 1833.
I'll say that's about the same point in time, as far as, war with the U.S., War of 1812 or whatever. But that was also the same point in time that we were getting kind of pissy with the British Navy for conscripting our merchant sailors or sailors on our merchant ships into service. So, but it's interesting that only that many ships, and then after everything, you know, from 2 to 5, and then the war kind of put the kibbutz on, put the kibbutz on that one. Like, yeah, no, we got to take in for something else, but to continue it after is still that's dedication right there.
And by the 1850s, around 25 vessels and 2,000 officers and men were on the station, supported by nearly 1,000 crewmen. Experienced fishermen recruited as sailors from what is now the coast of modern Liberia. It's worth noting that this was not a pleasant job, and the mortality rate was 5 times higher compared with fleets in the Mediterranean or in home waters. To help incentivize the crew, money was actually given to each crew per slave that they freed. But there was a real zeitgeist in Britain for the abolition of slavery. For example, the pursuit and capture of slave ships became celebrated naval engagements, widely reported back in peacetime Britain. They became a source of national pride, so it's no wonder that many of the crews really did have an evangelical zeal about the anti-slavery patrolling. However, I don't want to give the impression that this was all for humanitarian reasons. There's no doubt that Britain, in her foreign policy, used her anti-slavery laws as a stick with which to beat her opponents, primarily the Spaniards and the Portuguese, who refused to conform to these demands. Britain demanded Spain, Portugal, and the very new nation of Brazil to declare slave trading to be piracy. And while these nations paid lip service to these principles, they failed to enforce them, which led to a British blockade of Brazil by 1850, which of course forced the nascent Brazilian Empire to capitulate. And it didn't end there. In the 1860s, David Livingstone reports of Arab atrocities against enslaved Africans stirred up the interest of the British public, reviving the flagging abolitionist movement. Throughout the 1870s, the Navy attempted to suppress this abominable eastern trade at Zanzibar in particular. Needless to say, the British Navy continued their mission against the slavers across the Indian Ocean. The abolition of slavery became the British project. It captured the hearts and minds of the entire country, from the highest lord to the lowest peasant. This is certainly how the British saw it. For example, this spirit of chivalry, we see it in acts of heroism by land and sea in fights against the slave trade. Alfred Tennyson, the unweary, unostentatious, and inglorious crusade of England against slavery may probably be regarded as among the 3 or 4 perfectly virtuous pages comprised in the History of Nations. William Lecky. All of this was done against the vested financial interests of hundreds of thousands of people. Entire nations were against the idea of abolishing slavery and the slave trade. The very notion was alien to the human existence until Britain made it happen. In the 19th century, if you saw a ship bearing down on you, flying this flag, and you were a slave trader, you knew that this flag stood for liberty. This was the flag of a nation that defied human convention for a point of principle, and spent its blood, sweat, tears, and treasure to enforce it on the world. This is the flag of the nation that accepted the absolute moral truth that slavery is wrong. No matter what riches can be amassed, no matter what power can be gained, no matter the cost, slavery had to be abolished. That was the British Crusade. When Britain held the reins of world power, that is what she did with it. So Frankie, to be honest with you, when you say we have streets named after slave owners, we have profited from a vile crime and feel no shame, it is British people that don't learn languages or British history. Britain is the true scrounger, the true criminal. I have to concur. British people apparently do not learn British history because Britain's involvement in the slave trade is one of the most proud moments any nation could have had in their history. I want to make one thing crystal clear, Frankie. You live in a world without slavery because of Britain.
All right, so now I'll say this: well thought out, well put argument on Britain's role in ending slavery, not only for the British Empire itself and the territories that it held, but also, having other countries conform. That being said, some of the self-righteousness there at the end is it's kind of confusing because let's not pretend that the British Empire was completely innocent of I don't know, taking riches from other countries. So take the good with the bad there. There's still a lot of stuff that could have been better as far as the British Empire is concerned. It did the world a lot of good, but it also for the people that lived under British rule that weren't actually British. I mean, there's a reason why you've got so many countries that fought to throw you off. That being said, all of that being said, because I just find that the self righteous indignation absolutely hysterical at the end of the video. Um, taking and ending slavery whenever slavery throughout history and throughout mankind's history has been one of the few constants. It doesn't matter what nation has risen up. It doesn't matter what nation has, what empire has fallen. It doesn't matter the religion. None of that matters in relation to slavery because slavery is one of those things that's always been around from the first time. Some somebody said, "I want that land over there that these people are on, and the fruits that it bear, and give it to me." No, okay, we're gonna fight you, and because you didn't give it to us, now you're gonna take and work this land, and all the stuff that you would have reaped from it, you're gonna give to us, and you get breadcrumbs. That's happened since the dawn of civilization, since the first tribal merits, the first tribalization of mankind in and of itself. Whenever we stop going from being, whenever we, whether you're, once we stop taking and being so Bedouin like and just kind of going from here to there and actually set down roots, once we started taking and setting aside, setting up civilizations, slavery has existed. And the fact that the British, now granted, slavery still exists even in modern times. You look at the Sudan, you look at there's some Asian countries where it happens. It's not completely gone throughout the world, but as opposed to what it once was, yeah, yeah, the two British Empire definitely to be applauded for it because it what like I said, it's such a foreign. It's more of a foreign concept for slavery to be outlawed than for there to be slavery. That's more of a foreign concept in human history, in the annals of human history, than slavery. As bad as it was, as awful as it was more the norm than anything else. So, all these people that want to act all self righteous and indignant because, oh, your country had slaves. Motherfucker, if you lived there at that point in time as well, you'd have been part of the 90% of the citizenry that would have been okay with slaves yourself, because that was just the prevailing mindset of that time and had been for millennia. So piss off with the self-righteous indignation. It, you're stupid. You're no morally better. You were just born in a different time. Simple as that. So really good video. It really is. It really is. There's some stuff in there, like I said, that kind of stuck in my craw when I first watched it and everything. But it's really good at pointing out, hey, look, this was the case, but this is what happened. So it showed some of the warts, and it talked about the crusade that actually ended not only there in the British territories, but around the world as well, and other nations. So hope y'all enjoyed this, and I'll say this: this is on the Sargon of Akkad, that channel, and he's got the White Lotus podcast or radio show or whatever as well. And I screwed up the first time, and I actually was like, yeah, I'm not going to take and have anybody on the channel that parrots bigoted type things or sounds bigoted in their speech. And I did base level bullshit research, and that is my fault. I should have never done that, because normally I'm one of those people that goes hard in on looking at something and someone whenever somebody's accused of something. And I just took and heard a few different things and did not listen to contextual or, moreover, a lot more stuff that's said. And dude's more of a liberal than what a lot of folks here claim to be. He's also a provocateur and is very much for the freedom of thinking for oneself. So, yeah, that's a mistake I won't make on this channel. Definitely enjoyed this, and I should have left it up the first go round. That being said, y'all be good to each other, love yourselves. Peace.